Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Sons, and welcome back to the APO Productivity Talks, a series of discussion with international resource persons on productivity-related topics. Today, our topic is interesting, and we will look into balancing innovation and compliance through agile regulation. Regulation is significant. It protects public interest, ensures safety, fairness, and keep our economy stable. But here's the challenge. The world sometimes change faster than our rules. Outdated, rigid framework can slow down progress, block innovation, and competitiveness. That's where agile regulation comes in by offering a smarter, more adaptive way to keep up with today's fast-moving world. So how can government support innovation while ensuring effective compliance? And how can smarter regulation become a catalyst for productivity? To help us explore these questions, we are honored to welcome our guest speaker today, Mr. Mohamad Izahar bin Mohamad Izham, partner and head of the government advisory practice at Zaid Ibrahim and Company Malaysia, with extensive experience advising government across ASEAN countries on regulatory reform and public sector transformation. Mr. Izahar will bring valuable perspective on how agile governance and can unlock innovation and enhance productivity. So get ready for an interesting session with real-world example and actionable insights. Now let's give a warm welcome to our speaker today, Mr. Izahar, please.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Happy to be here. Thank you, San.
Yeah. Thank you, Izahar, for being with us today. So, Izahar, before we start, could you please introduce a little bit about yourself?
Okay, San. I'm a lawyer by training, by practice, but I'm not your traditional lawyer. I think keeping in line with the presentation today, being innovative, right? So I don't go to court. I don't draft legal documents, but what I do is work on public policy and law reform. So I've been advising governments and regulators on policy and reform for around the last 10 years in Malaysia. And the last 3 or 4 years, I've also expanded my practice to cover ASEAN.
Okay. Thank you, Izahar. To Oliver. Actually, I first met Izahar during a APO capacity building program on GRP in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. So after hearing him speak, I knew that I had to invite him for our P-Talk. And before we start, just a quick reminder to our viewer that there will be a live question and answer right after the presentation by our speaker. So if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat box. So Izahar, we are so ready now. So please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, San. So I'm taking control of the slides now. And, before I begin, if you look at the slides that I have ahead of you, I kind of like to set the stage on the learnings for today. And I've kind of set it out into three kind of broad principles that we're going to look at. Number one, essentially what is agile regulation, what it covers, its benefits. Number two, I like to share with you some of the use cases and examples of agile regulation, especially those that I've personally experienced in my line of work. And number three, I think, what I've been talking about with you is what are the actionable items that, governments and regulators can actually take away from this presentation. So, I think we're going to share with them what we think, but what should they do after they listen to this presentation and what should they take away? If you look at the slide ahead of you right now, and I like to also set the stage in terms of, what is the problem with regulation, right? If we kind of think about it, and if I could ask you, there are several things, and I think the first one that I'd like to talk about is the fact that regulations are static, right? They're kind of in a way set in stone. They are created to regulate something at a point in time that it was created. So as you know, as with anything, laws are not made to last forever. And most likely, whatever industry or business that they are regulating has now changed, right? I mean, you can see in front of you the examples of drones, but I like to talk about cat cafes, because you have cafes nowadays that have pets that have cats, but that actually infringes local authority bylaws because you can't have animals mixing with your food. That it goes against what a cafe should do. Another thing that I also like to talk about in terms of the traditional approach to regulating is the second part to it is that most regulations over time, if you don't relook, revisit, and revise them, they become unnecessary or irrelevant, right? So things that were regulated back in the day that they were trying to regulate back then because of risk issues or whatnot are now deemed as outdated practices or not practiced anymore. I give you an extreme example, but I think it's a good one. It's actually working from home. And I think if you look at labor laws in most countries, they would specify you need to designate where an employee's workplace is, what are their working hours. But when it comes to working from home, then it totally changes the way that you have to regulate how your employees work, where they work, and so on. So those practices quickly become archaic, quickly become outdated, and need to be revamped and relooked into. And probably the third point that I want to make into the traditional approach of regulating is that most regulation, that was made a long time ago is prescriptive, right? And when I mean prescriptive, it's very specific, very detailed. The focus is spelled out with a lot of detail and length. One example which I think is common in a lot of jurisdictions is, in your contracts law, for example, in Malaysia, for a long time, it said that if you want to sign a contract agreement, it has to be in wet ink pen. So when it comes to digitalization and technology, why can't you then recognize digital signature? You should, because the intent and the veracity of the signature is still the same. It's still legal, but just because the law is outdated and says it has to be wet ink, then therefore suddenly it becomes illegal, and therefore you need to quickly look into these laws and update, revisit, and improve them. So this example of drones that I put up here, kind of summarizes the 3 points I made earlier, because today's businesses and industries are extremely complex, right? When you take drones, for example, most people just use it for recreational purposes. In that case, they're just taking photos, they're just playing with drones with their children. But because of the way that it infringes on certain aspects of existing law, and therefore you need a permit to fly these drones, and then it becomes very impractical for you to use it, because in most cases, who will actually apply for these permits when they want to use this technology just for recreational purposes? So the law needs to keep up with the industries and the businesses, and this is where we go to my next slide, which is what I like to talk about, the pacing problem. Now, when we say pacing problem, that is where the businesses are moving faster than the regulations, right? The regulations cannot keep pace with the businesses. The law lags behind the businesses, and it's always playing catch up with what businesses do. I'm using the classical example of short-term rentals. Most of you probably know or understand it as Airbnb. I mean, Airbnb is one of many operators, but probably that's more familiar to you. But essentially, the activity is short-term rental. Now, this business model, which began around 2008 in San Francisco, was a disruptor, right, to traditional accommodation, which, in most countries, you see tenancies or leases, which are done privately, usually on a fixed term basis, or you have hotel legislation, which is on the other end of the spectrum. But this short-term rentals kind of falls within the gray area, so to speak. It's something that's not in black and white regulation of laws. And if you look at the growth of the industry after several years of scaling and also expanding in multiple jurisdictions over time, 2011, 2016, and then you kind of see around the years of 2016 to 24, it's starting to get regulated, right? In some jurisdictions, not all, and also to a varying degree, meaning to say some are, regulatory, which they have explicit laws, and some they use non-regulatory instruments. It could be guidelines, it could be non-regulatory options in that sense. Now, the challenge with the industries like this is it's increasingly complex to regulate. For example, these platforms exist in a cloud, right? They most likely don't have physical presence in your local jurisdiction. They may not have any office space in your jurisdiction, and they are also likely to be incorporated in different jurisdictions, meaning to say that they are regulated by different regulators in other jurisdictions. Now, the owners who rent the property to the individuals, right, they have to comply with existing and local laws. So they are kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum, because this would not only involve, the international laws, but also local laws in your jurisdiction. And in that sense, it become very complicated to kind of regulate for these type of businesses because they are cross-border. And because these businesses are also not sectoral anymore, right? So in this case, we're looking at accommodation. But if we take, for example, e-hailing, which is transport based, you can see these days that these operators have moved beyond the traditional sectoral businesses of industries that they are in, and they're doing multiple things. For example, e-hailing operators are doing food delivery, and even in some jurisdictions like Malaysia, they're doing banking. So the businesses or the industries that they are operating in are no more sectoral, which means probably one regulator, which was the case back in the day. But in this day and age, they are regulated by multiple horizontal regulators, such as the Transport Ministry, the Health Ministry, the Finance Ministry, and so on. So it is becoming increasingly complex simply because the business model is not as straightforward and direct as it used to be in the past. Let's jump into what I mean by agile regulation, the topic of the day, before we go into too much deeper on the concepts, the theories, and the sharing. Let me kind of demystify what we mean by agile regulation. It sounds interesting, but it's actually very simple to understand. And the conversation that I had with Sun, I think the most important thing about agile regulation is actually to shift the default mindset of regulating or regulation. Don't say no, right? Most regulators that I meet, when I see them for the first time and we talk about old, archaic, outdated legislation or regulation, they always say, no, we cannot change that because that is already in the law, right? When they're faced with innovation, and probably in most cases they're not incentivized to change this regulation. They say, look, this is already the black letter of the law. What you are doing now is illegal, and that's exactly true, because if the law says no, you shouldn't be doing it, then therefore it's illegal. But the mindset or the default mindset we're trying to gravitate or move towards is to say, wait a minute, if it's illegal now, should it therefore change to be legal? Or is there a need for us to revisit in terms of why it's illegal? And that's what we're trying to advocate for. We want them to not say no when they're faced with this innovation or disruption, but kind of have the approach to revisit these regulatory frameworks and understand why it's illegal, and perhaps then look into revising these laws or policies. The second part to agile regulation, it's an approach to regulatory delivery. And what that means is when we are implementing regulatory interventions, there are various ways and tools that we can apply this agile regulation. It's not a one size fits all model, but there are various tools in your toolkit as a regulator that you can use. And I think I'll share a bit more on the next slide. And the last part is then to focus on results. The shift should not be to have very detailed or prescriptive regulation. Again, going back to it needs to be signed by a black ink pen and so on. But instead, as long as it's signed, then therefore it should be legal, it should be valid. The outcome and the results are more important than the method or the mode. Now I'm going to the next slide of how does agile regulation fit into good regulatory practice, and it's very much related in terms of the concepts. If you look at the slide that is in front of you right now, this is a typical life cycle of a law or regulation. And this is my kind of illustration of a simple illustration of how I see it. You develop the law policy on the left, you start drafting it, it becomes a law. You should review it and have some sort of post review of the law, right? Built in, or if not built in, every 3 to 5 years. And then you have the ad hoc review as and when you require to do it. And then you look into possibly repealing that law. If you look at the top and bottom part of this slide, there are various tools that are intertwined inside this life cycle of regulation, and it's scattered, and by no means is this exhaustive. There are so many more, but probably these are the more popular ones: regulatory impact analysis, regulatory experimentation, deregulation, ex post evaluations, and so on. The point that I'm trying to make here is at any point in time during the life cycle of a regulation or law, we can apply these tools to improve the quality of a regulation. And that's what regulators need to be aware of. Don't only think that regulation starts at the beginning when it's born. Leave it until it dies, right? That's, I think, in a very simplistic way. But remember, in this life cycle, all these tools can come in, right? In the regulatory development process, it's not meant to be static. Some people use the word living, breathing document, an iterative, ongoing process that is continuous throughout the life cycle of the law itself. Now, agile regulation worldwide, I think, is advocated by many international organizations. I'm not going to double click into any of this because we have some slides later. But as you can see, I think probably what is quite telling is it's quite recent. This concept and appreciation, I guess, understanding of what agile regulation is about. There was a toolkit issued by the World Economic Forum in 2020. OECD has a lot of content and material. I think even last week or last 2 weeks, they issued the OECD Regulatory Policy Outlook. If you've not read it, please do. And even at APEC level, they're developing an implementation toolkit on agile regulation this year. So there's a lot of material and content out there, and don't see one as mutually exclusive. I think they should all be read together in terms of the literature and the body of knowledge in terms of understanding what is agile regulation. Agile regulation around the world. This is kind of a snapshot. Again, this is by no means exhaustive. This is my illustration just from the research that I've done. There are more countries, if your country is not listed here, my apologies, but definitely there are more countries, that have agile regulatory frameworks. I think what is telling for me is three things. Number one, no one has exhaustively been able to map out or complete database of agile regulation examples and application around the world. There's so many. Number two, this also goes back to the fact that the body of literature, again, the knowledge is still growing. And as you can see from the previous slide, again, fairly new, perhaps in the last 5 to 10 years only, we started having this conversation about agile regulation. And number three, what you'll see in the next slide is also the specific definition of agile regulation varies, right? Although in principle, it covers the same concepts in terms of the various tools, but different jurisdictions apply different tools differently. So there's a lot, but maybe some are more familiar with specific ones compared to others. And before I jump into the next slide, I just want to make a specific mention of Malaysia, which is the jurisdiction that I'm quite familiar with. And I think in the digital economy blueprint of 2020, there was an initiative to develop a code of conduct essentially for regulators to apply this agile regulation. And it's taken some time. It's actually morphed into an agile regulation handbook, and that is likely to be issued sometime this year. So actually, for the regulators in Malaysia, when they want to develop agile regulation, there'll be some sort of guidance form created domestically for them in order to apply to our domestic regulation or laws. Now, from the literature that I've digested over time, I think for the purposes of this talk, I like to use this example from the World Economic Forum, and I think it's easy for everyone to kind of digest for sharing purposes. The WEF framework sets out seven kind of tools or approaches in terms of what agile regulation means. I'll just read it out very quickly. Number one, anticipatory regulation. Number two, outcome focused regulation. Number three, experimental regulation. Number four, data-driven regulation. Number five, self and co-regulation. Number six, joined up regulation. And number six, international regulatory cooperation. Don't worry, we're going to double click into each tool after this. But I think what's important for you to know is that none of this is exclusive, meaning to say that you, as a regulator, you don't have to choose one or the other. You can actually apply all. If in your case you think that this works for you in your policy development, you can use these tools in any particular initiative or policy that you are developing. So you're not limited to one, right? You can use all, you can use some, you can use one. It's up to you in your policy development process. I'll jump to the first approach, right? And this is in relation to anticipatory regulation. Now, what is anticipatory regulation? I think the name is quite suggestive in itself. To anticipate, right? What does to anticipate mean? I think being proactive and forward thinking is critical to leverage on emerging opportunities. And I'm just reading that top line right there. In most cases, you won't be the first one to deal with innovation or disruption, right? It may have already happened somewhere around the world and it's making its way to your jurisdiction. Let's take the classical case of e-hailing here. Could be Grab, could be Uber, whatever form of businesses. There are a lot of new ones in this day and age. In the context of Malaysia, it started early in the years of 2010, 2011. So about 15 years ago. In fact, that's what we formerly know as e-hailing is actually application based, but what we call locally in Malaysia as a kereta sapu, right, is basically someone who is offering their services to provide last mile transportation has been around since time immemorial without the app, but they're just saying, look, I can take you here for a certain amount of money and providing that last mile transportation from the train station to your house, for example. The regulation for e-hailing was developed around the years of 2018 and 2019. So what does this mean? The industry came about 2010, regulation came about 10 years later. But in this case, the regulators actually had the opportunity to see, right, and understand what the industry was doing, develop itself, mature before actually developing appropriate regulation in terms of government intervention. And by the time the regulation came into place, it wasn't something totally new or different than what others were doing worldwide. There was the ability for us in Malaysia to benchmark with other countries, I believe like UK, like Singapore, to see and learn from what they were doing, observing and importing the best practices. And on this score, the conversation has now, even shifted to developing gig workers regulation. So, we actually wait and learn to actually see the maturity of the legislation regulation as well as the industry before introducing that regulation while having the foresight to create laws. And as I said earlier, we're going to the 2.0 in looking at legislation for gig economy or gig workers, which also developing countries have started to introduce. Now, if I jump to the second approach, and this is the one on outcome focus regulation, what do we mean by that? I mean, if I look at the top line again, that focus on essentially outcomes or goal rather than dealing with rules for compliance specific prescriptive details. And a good example that I like to share, on outcome focused regulation is on personal data legislation. I'm quite familiar with the one in Malaysia. If you look on the right, and this shows how personal data is regulated. In this case, there are seven overarching principles. I'm not going to read it all. I think you can see. And these principles guide a regulatee on how to comply without focusing on prescriptive methods, but instead tangible outcomes. So if you see on the right, it doesn't tell you how to do it, right? It's just telling you what these principles are. So let's just pick one just for discussion purposes. If we talk about data security and retention, outcome focused regulation will not spell out in specific detail, for example, how many data servers you must have, how many backup servers you must have, what are your emergency retention procedures, and how do they look like, and so on. So these things are not spelled out at great length, but it's more of you ensuring that that data is secure and not leaked. So at the end of the day, as long as you can ensure that the data of the user is secure and not unauthorized and disclosed without authority, therefore then you have fulfilled the obligation of the regulation. It doesn't matter how you are doing it. And in some cases, there may be subsidiary instruments or subsidiary code standards which could give this qualitative guidance on the principles, but never in precise or exhaustive and even minute detail. Let me go on to the third, principle or approach, and this is on experimental regulation. I believe this is the most popular. I probably don't have to, go into a lot of explanation on this. It goes by a lot of names. It goes by, a lot of definitions. The most popular one, I would definitely say, and I think the one everyone out there is thinking off the top of their mind is regulatory sandbox, right? Or regulatory experimentation. This is quite a game changer in regulatory approaches because essentially what this says to us, governments or regulators or policymakers, is that it's okay not to be perfect. We can accept trial and error. The other problem with regulation is that it takes a long time to develop, and partially because we have a fixation with accuracy. We want it to be the most perfect, the most complete, the best regulation, and the best law, which is fine and understandable. But the problem with that is as time passes, as assumptions change, and when things happen, it can be difficult to legislate without actually revisiting in totality your earlier work. And if that's the case, you will actually never be able to pass legislation because you're waiting to get that perfect data, which would most likely never be the case. Therefore, if we are flexible in testing innovation in a controlled environment, with certain parameters that gives us confidence with actually seeing the results of doing the right thing, therefore, it will give us confidence that the policy or the intervention that we are proposing is the right one, right? Hence, in this case, there are various, regulatory sandboxes that have emerged, I think, worldwide. There's data on this. Some are formal, right? Some are set up by statute. Some are set up by governments. Some are informal, ad hoc. So regulators from time to time, ministries or agencies, if they want to do a sandbox on certain things, on certain issues such as drones, they'll set up a drone sandbox. Some are sector specific, so it could be focused on sectoral issues like transport. I think fintech is the pioneer in, of course, sandbox. They've been the one leading the charge for many, many years. So it's been finance sector, banking sector, and of course, overarching. There's some sandbox that cover all sectors because they have the platform to bring together, multiple regulators, and they can cover these complex issues or, complex innovations under a single umbrella sandbox. So it could be, overarching sandbox as well. But I think the point is experimental regulation or sandbox is a good way to show that, by testing regulations or laws and actually seeing the results gives us confidence in terms of knowing that that is the right intervention without having to wait and finally pass, full-blown legislation, which could take a very long time. I'm going to jump to the fourth, approach, and this is the data-driven approach. And I think this is actually one that is quite interesting. It's a bit forward-thinking. This goes back to the definition again that regulation shouldn't be static, not cast in stone, right? Not left in time. With advancement in technology these days, it's actually quite possible to leverage on big data to improve the quality of regulation. For example, here is one on speed limits on the road. Let's imagine regulations in the past, right? For example, if we have to regulate for a big mega lane highway against a small inner city road passing by a school, what would that regulation or law look like? And how do we actually determine that speed limit? Now, based on, manual studies done and certain assumptions, we can say that if it's a mega lane, mega road, mega highway, the speed limit would probably 100 to 120 kilometers an hour. And if it's a small inner road, it's perhaps 20 to 40 kilometer per hour, miles per hour, whichever metrics you want to use. But I'm just generalizing here, and I'm just giving you these ideas for you to think about it. So don't debate me on the figures in your question and answers. But what data-driven regulation advocates for is that we can now use technology, in this case, perhaps cameras, to actually track and design better regulation, what the actual speed limit should be instead of the guesstimate that we were doing before. Now, in this case, the technology can actually record, right, and monitor real-time data 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to, take into account various factors for these different roads. For example, the volume of the traffic, the weather patterns, whether it's a festive season, whether it's a public holiday, and also what are road user behaviors and trends. Maybe, over time, the road users are not using the roads anymore there. They're taking public transport, they're carpooling, or maybe there's an increase because these are, new areas where people are migrating to, so on and so forth. So rather than have a regulation or requirement that is in perpetuity, we can use data to determine what is the most appropriate intervention at any particular period in time. Let me jump to the next one, and this is the fifth approach on the self and co-regulation. Now, when we talk about self and co-regulation, I like to talk about the life cycle again of regulation, right? And when you approach regulation, in most cases, every industry starts from no regulation, right? Nothing, all the way to explicit regulation. So government command and control. The question that I like to pose is, when do you regulate? And this is a very complex or difficult question to answer, because there is no threshold or trigger point that tells a regulator when to enact a regulation. So as I said earlier, if the problem in relation to cars, if you have 10 cars, 50 cars, 100 cars, there is no threshold to say, okay, now we are facing 100 cars and therefore we need to introduce regulation. There's no such trigger point. So along that kind of life cycle, we somehow have to move the needle ourselves, and therefore we have to determine what to do in the meantime. Businesses will still operate, right? And customers would still want some degree of protection when they take up these businesses or industries, or use these products or services. Therefore, it's actually in the interest of the industries themselves to conform to some kind of standard in the absence of government prescribed or explicit regulation. The message here is for regulators to look at the extreme ends, but at the at same time, kind of understand that there is a space in the middle between no regulation and explicit regulation. There are things that you can do in between. I don't want to single out any particular industry in this case here, but my observation is that this self and co-regulation happens when the industry is mature enough to propose regulation by itself. And if these industries happen to be regulated in other jurisdictions, chances are they can also bring these best practices and standards of regulating with them into new and emerging markets. Now, the difference between self-regulation and co-regulation is the degree of control, where for self-regulation it's industry driven, whereas for co-regulation usually it's also with the government or government endorsed. I'm moving to the sixth approach, and this is joined up regulation. And I think this is one of the easier ones. I think you can visualize this from my analogy earlier in my opening presentation. This is taking a coordinated whole of government approach to achieve goals. Now, whole of government means working with every aspect or angle of the government, involving all the regulators that exist in that particular ecosystem. By now, you would have seen the complexity with multiple regulators that are faced with disruptive and innovative businesses. So it's not a sectoral issue anymore; it's a horizontal issue, and a lot of people, a lot of regulators have to be involved. Now, this example is on electric vehicles or EV. If you think about the value chain of EV, there's so many different aspects. For example, manufacturing, battery recycling, financial incentives, and so on. So they're interrelated, but they're also distinct. And for every aspect that I mentioned earlier, this would also involve multiple ministries, multiple agencies. And on top of that, these regulators could exist at different levels of governments. They could be at federal level, state level, or even at local authority level, which makes it even more complex. And the last principle or approach that I want to share with you is on international regulatory cooperation. This is where you have to provide a cross-border solution to an overarching issue. Now, you may think straight away off the top of your head about bilateral and multilateral commitments, and you're not wrong here, right? The classical example in this case would be the online platforms. They don't exist in any particular country, any particular jurisdiction. They could exist offshore, be incorporated there, but they may not exist in your jurisdiction. And how do you then enforce local country laws on these entities that are beyond your jurisdiction? I'm using this digital service tax example that we have in Malaysia, where we tried to, tax these digital platforms that operate outside Malaysia. Of course, they are operating in our jurisdiction, they're collecting revenue from our jurisdiction, and they're not paying tax in our jurisdiction, and because they don't have that presence. And therefore, this digital service tax should be able to regulate them and statutorily impose tax onto them. But the question is, how do you actually enforce and collect these taxes? Now, what happens, if these organizations don't pay? As you know, there is no extra territorial jurisdiction to actually sue them and bring them to the Malaysian courts or justice in Malaysia. Therefore, the recourse that we need in terms of creating this legislation, which we want to be functional, we want to be applicable, right? If not, there's no point to create this legislation if it cannot be enforced or applied. And in this case, the only solution is to actually work with other governments, collaborate with them, speak to them, talk to them about other issues, and see how that if they don't comply in our jurisdiction, we can get these other jurisdictions to actually assist us in, reciprocally enforcing these, judgments or laws in those jurisdictions. Now it's difficult, but this is the way to actually go beyond your borders and go beyond jurisdiction to look into these platforms which are also cross-border in nature. And most are, they don't exist in any particular jurisdiction, particularly your jurisdiction, and they could exist, across the world. Now I'll move on to the benefits, and I'm coming towards the end of my presentation here. I think it's important to kind of visualize what the benefits of agile regulation is and how you can adopt it into your practice. A good example is e-hailing, and I think everyone is quite familiar with it. As I move from left to right and go clockwise, I think the first benefit is on regulatory flexibility. Basically, it helps you knowing how to deal with disruption and innovation. So when you are faced with this innovation disruption, you have that toolkit that I mentioned earlier, right? So it helps you, assess them, kind of create regulation, and also kind of move away from that default say no mentality. I think the second one, as we move to the right, is the holistic planning. Um, and when I say holistic planning, it's no longer an isolated problem. It's not just you. It becomes an industry or government issue. Moving down to the bottom right, and I think this is critical, the market opportunities. Of course, the economic benefits. I think the numbers are clear, not just in Malaysia, but globally. In any industry that's disrupting and creating innovation, they are here to stay. People talk about AI and whether you need to know about AI and whether AI regulation will come. AI is definitely here to stay. It will only scale and expand over time. And the last one is on further innovation. Like I said earlier, the e-hailing companies traditionally just send people, deliver people. Now they're delivering food. Now they're becoming digital banks. So again, the question becomes, what will they be tomorrow? Extremely more complex, more diverse, and even bigger than before. So, what are the actionable items that regulators can do? This is the call to action. Most importantly, change the default mindset. Apply agile regulation as an evidence-based approach, as any good regulatory practice data is important. The power of collaboration. You are not alone. You are not a silo. Work with other ministries, agencies, and even with other governments. And again, I think most importantly, no one size fits all. You have to look at every issue on its own. It's complex, but you have to tailor make, design your own solutions. And this is perhaps already my last slide. And I think you would have caught on to this in the earlier slide. I didn't read it, but this is my favorite quote from OECD to actually capture the essence of agile regulation. I think it perfectly sums up what regulators need to do. You need to move from that traditional regulate and forget mindset and actually appreciate this adapt and learn approach. I think thank you very much for being a good audience, attentive listener. I hope there are very good questions in the box. I'm happy to take the questions. I'll pass it back to Sun to moderate the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Izahar. I think it's very interesting, presentation, and we very impressed with the example and the way you explain about, agile regulation. I think it's very timely for our presentation or our talk today, because I think that's now mostly, I think, and I believe that in most countries now they relies on, prescriptive approach while developing the regulation, right? And then our technology and everything is now like blooming, changing every day. So it's much clearer for us now. So let's now go to the question and answer session. So before I invite any question from our viewer, so maybe perhaps I can have some question for you first. And I know you explained now, agile regulation, but just let make it a little bit simple for our viewers. So can you just explain it, define it in a more simple terms, and what strategies can help drive the adoption of agile regulation within governmental institution? Because in the governmental institution, it's really hard sometimes, to accept any change. Yeah. Thank you. Can you please?
Okay, thank you, San. This is a very good question, and I think I was saving it for my summary, but I think it's quite appropriate to answer this here. To me, the most important thing about regulation is the never say no attitude or mindset. I think I mentioned earlier in my line of work when I meet regulators, and it's I'm going to them with a new business, new industry. Innovation. They are trained, I think over time to say that, look, this is the law that we have right now. This is the law that has been developed by our government, by our policymakers, and therefore we stand by it. And I do understand why. I mean, in recent time we've had policy divisions in a lot of ministries and agencies, and the policy divisions obviously they think differently. The legal people they are more on the enforcement side, they're more on the technical side, but the policy people they kind of have the forward thinking mindset. I would say most likely in these cases they are not incentivized. Why would they need to allow your business to operate? Why would they need to change the law for your industry to flourish? So for them I think sometimes it's an issue of being incentivized. Maybe there is no incentive to change the law and develop the law. But I think now, having worked with a lot of policy teams in government, they're starting to change that mindset. They see that, look, it's not because we have to uphold and enforce traditional regulation. We need to be forward thinking in working with industry. And in fact, and I think this applies across, in many countries across the world, that a lot of regulators are very collaborative, right? If you are in any of these industries, if you approach government, I'm very happy to say they've moved away from that mindset. They don't say no anymore. They're willing to hear you out, and in fact, the chances are they will invite you into the policy development. So again, if you are regulated in other jurisdictions, they welcome the sharing of best practices. How have they done it in neighboring ASEAN countries? How have they done it in European countries? What are you doing with your policy teams worldwide? Of course, governments and regulators take this with a pinch of salt. They're not going to take everything that you say and just apply it in your country or jurisdiction. They will adapt and adopt it accordingly. It's a matter of learning. And again, like I said to you, it's using all these multiple tools, becoming, anticipatory benchmarking with other jurisdictions, then conducting regulatory experimentation. So we design it in a local context, in a Malaysian context, and then we test it out, right? We don't have to be perfect anymore. We don't have to wait for the best regulation. We try it out and then being iterative. So let's say we get data that, okay, maybe the speed limit shouldn't be 20, it should be 50. Then we can always change that because we're getting data from the technology that we're using. And then again, using these tools, working cross-border, because we know that, for example, platforms don't exist in Malaysia. So we work with our neighbors, we work with ASEAN Secretariat, we work with international organizations to help us enforce this. So I think in a nutshell, it is that mindset, Sun, and that's where
Yeah.
it's always going to be a good starting point. You need to change that default mindset.
Yes. Thank you, Izahar. I totally agree with you. So the key problem here is how we change the mindset of people. But it's good to know that now there are many countries in the world, they started using the new approach, the agile approach in developing a regulation. It is kind of, a game or any the policy that, apply to all that you cannot avoid it. It's a trend. Otherwise, your country will be left behind, right? So talking about, agile regulation, I understand it's kind of, more flexible approach that you put the outcome for, set the framework for regulation rather than like put a prescriptive to mention about what activity you are allowed to do, what activity you're not allowed to do, something like that. So so take it back. So can you share one example where the rigid regulation, in contrary to the flexible regulation, can refrain or stifle innovation, and what lesson can we draw from that?
Okay, thank you, San. There are a lot of examples, but I just want to give a very simple example because I think simple examples are easy for us to visualize. And one thing that I find very funny is like you said just now. I think just picking up on your words is prescriptive regulation, rigid regulation. In many countries now we have cafes. on water or in lakes. And this is a kind of a tourism, ecotourism kind of thing. Of course, I'm not talking about very deep water. I'm just talking about kind of knee high, very low areas. And these places, they attract people. They when people go there, of course there's spending, there's growth. I see a lot of out of inner city tourism in these cases, because they attract a lot of people to go there over the weekend. Families, people spend, people go there, people stay there, and so on. But of course, when we look at traditional, local authority regulation or licensing, it is very rigid. It's spelled down to the T. I've seen, and I'm just talking about local authority regulation or bylaws at this point in time. I've seen, for example, they even regulate how much toilets can collect. Toilets can collect, for example, 50 cents for the first hour. After the second hour, they can collect between, certain amount, and so on and so on. So is very, very, very prescriptive. And again, going back to the intent, should we be very prescriptive? And in the case of these, cafes that are existing in these, small rivers or, kind of water areas, is a shame because they don't comply with, of course, the requirements of a restaurant. Definitely, they can't have chairs in water. They can't have, operating or businesses or selling food on water. But if we think about it and we go back to the purpose of regulation, why are we regulating? Why are we doing this? Why are we creating the regulation? And of course, the answer is a risk, right? To protect people, to protect consumers. But in this case, again, we have to think, is there an actual risk? Because these regulations or bylaws were designed for a specific purpose. Maybe in that day, if it was envisaged for a establishment. Obviously, you can't have water in your establishment, it'll slip. But in this case, we need to be agile and flexible to understand that, look, there is a need. This boosts ecotourism. This drives people into rural areas, right? This creates job opportunities. There is a market. And when we go back to the real question or intent, is there a risk? The risk is most likely low. I'm not saying that there is no risk. I'm not saying that people may not fall, people may not get hurt, or people may not get injured. But again, going back to the overarching concept here, which is obviously good regulatory practice. Good regulatory practice makes us question, when we create regulation, what is the problem that we're trying to address? And secondly, is there any data and evidence to support that? So if it's just us assuming our biasness, in this case, it's just on water, the old laws are regulating it, but there's no actual cases of people getting injured, then why should that infringe regulation and stifle innovation? I mean, that's just a very
Yeah.
basic, easy example, but I think it's easy for people to visualize why we need
Yeah.
to rethink regulating
Yeah.
in cases like that.
Yeah, totally, Izhar, because I agree with you that sometimes, when we develop the regulation, it really need to be, rely on the data. And also it's because sometimes if we put too much there, sometimes, it's not really totally agreed by the people. And then there's a tendency that the people go against, right? They try to break it. So talking about, agile regulation, I know this, you mentioned about the share regulation and core regulation. So, but to implement this, it often require a high level industrial maturity to to avoid the situation that the business may take advantage of. That's a flexible approach for their benefits. So, what are some strategies to encourage the responsible self-governance among the businesses?
Okay, thank you, San. So you're absolutely right. The kind of balancing exercise in this case that we need to consider is the principle or concept of regulatory capture. You probably know this, and others may know this as well. But that is when regulators become kind of sympathetic to those that they're regulating. So you work with them, and then at the end of the day, the regulation is in a way compromised or designed to benefit them only. I mean, I don't think it's a of course, it's something that we fear, but at the end of the day, that's the regulators' balancing exercise. They need to be aware and conscious of that. But most regulators that I've worked with, I think they are very aware and they're very driven in their own policy outlook. So, right, even though we know of regulatory capture, but obviously they have their own mandate and they know what limits they can prescribe and regulate. So, I mean, jumping to the second part of your question is on the responsibility of self-regulation. And this is, what I talked about earlier. There is no threshold to regulate. That is the real difficulty when we approach regulation. Unfortunately, when regulators get the playbook of developing policy and law, there is no way for them to tell. Even when, I use the example of e-hailing, it took almost 10 years for us to introduce regulation or law. But what happens in between that period, right?
Mm.
Let me just use that as an example to answer this question. Because there cannot be nothing, right? Because our people who are the users, they would definitely want to use these platforms or apps, right? Because these businesses are flourishing. Government has yet to create regulation. So what these businesses are do, and I think it's quite responsible, is that they are advocating for some sort of regulation. It may not be in the form of explicit government regulation. That's where we talk about the self-regulation, and usually, it's done not just by one industry player. They come together, they form associations. They have, as you know, they are very organized these days. They have these specific organizations that they can be part of, or international organization that they can be part of, and they assist in the developing of self-regulation, some form of safety standard, some sort of code of conduct, which industry should actually aspire to. And actually, what I see is when it's driven by these organizations, they're quite responsible in taking best practice. So it's not just something that is done overnight or an afterthought. They developed it, taking into best practice of what they've done overseas. And of course, I would think that they're incentivized to do so, son, because as you and me are users, we want to ensure that if we use their products, we use their services, we want some degree of protection. And in the absence of government protection, right, who is going to help us to regulate? It has to be these industries creating some sort of self-regulation. So I see it's a very positive step, and the the higher degree or extent would be the co-regulation. To some extent, sometimes the regulators actually give some sort of legislative power to create this code. So there's legislative backing or support, but essentially they are the same because governments are essentially at that point in time they're quite hands off, but they allow these industries to regulate and determine what is the best form of self-regulation or co-regulation.
Thank you, Isa. I think it's yes, that's a very good advice and a good example because I think in the past or mostly now the common thing when the government or regulator if they don't know how to regulate something, they rather is it because they it's very new so sometimes they just stop it instead of uh, waiting for the policy to have any policies on this. So but as you said, we cannot have nothing by waiting for it because the use as a user as a citizen they need it, right? So I think you also mentioned about the important voice of the association of the industry. They also very taking a very important part in in implementing and also proposing to the regulator to have a more flexible approach while waiting for have a complete regulation to be settled to be developed on that particular matter. So maybe we have one more enough time for one more question. So I would like to know how can the regulator and business can collaborate to develop agile regulation that support both innovation and compliance.
Thank you, San. As you know, as probably following from the previous question, I think this is what we see happening nowadays, right? In the past, regulators would be in silo, so they would, obviously work on their own. They wouldn't work with other regulators. They would develop their own policy mandate. They would draft their own laws. But as part of agile regulation or good regulatory practice, I think we've spoken about this before. There are certain tenets or foundations that are now embedded, right? And I think number one, definitely in GRP and also in agile regulation itself is consultation. So in Malaysia, definitely I've seen increase of the private sector being interested in good regulatory practice, which is quite initially alarming. I didn't really understand why would private sector businesses or industries or associations want to understand how GRP is applied. But after speaking to them, I actually understand the angle they're coming from. Is because they want to understand how can they be involved in the policy making process, right? How can they not be left behind? And they actually understand that from GRP by right. As you know, as a fundamental foundation of GRP being consultation, stakeholders need to be consulted, right? They need to be engaged. They need to be involved in the regulatory reform or lawmaking process. And it doesn't matter to what extent, because when we do or design our consultation, we will do a regulatory mapping, a sort of heat map, or in terms of the priority of stakeholders. But to some degree, almost all stakeholders are charted in the heat map. And we know in this case that, however small your interest or your influence in the, regulatory design of that policy, you would be consulted at some stage, right? Whether it's directly engaged, whether it's informally engaged through online tools, town hall sessions, various ways and forms. So in this case, by right, it's actually embedded in the policy making process to collaborate with the businesses. So even though, I think people has asked me before, do you have legislation that mandatorily makes it require for you to consult with businesses? There are some, legislation bits and pieces that says consultation is required for this proposal. But I think overarching, right, you need to involve the businesses and industries, and that is embedded in our good regulatory practice policy. And I think in almost every country, right, this is a requirement for them to collaborate. So going back to what you said, there is no doubt that they have to be involved in that process to some extent. But I guess the other challenge, and maybe just to give you my 2 cents on this, is sometimes businesses say, look, even though we are engaged, consulted in the design, but our input is not reflected, right? And that goes back to the purpose of consultation. When you consult somebody, right? If I'm consulting that particular business, I, as a regulator, need to manage that expectation, right? Because when you consult somebody, it may not be the case that you are necessarily wanting to use their input. Maybe you're only getting certain feedback, but that degree of involvement needs to be well communicated. And I think in most cases, in this consultation process, because I do a lot of work on consultation as well, there is a very lack of managing expectation, right? When we bring stakeholders, we tell them this is a workshop, tell us your views and give us your feedback, and the people go away thinking, look, I'm gonna, I've made a big policy change and they're gonna take into account what I said. But sometimes they get frustrated and say, no, I've told you so many times, but nothing happens. So I think it is that managing of expectation which is quite important.
Thank you very much, Isa. I think it's very interesting. I think consultation also, as you mentioned, is often lacking, in all the, most of the country when they do the regulation. And this is the mismatch that the regulator, they should enhance in the future if they want to increase the effectiveness and quality of the regulation. So I'm very sorry that we have, we run out of time now. We're going to the closing of the session very soon. So thank you very much again, Izham, for the valuable able insight and also the time for OP Talk today. We learned a lot from you about how Agile regulation can drive innovation, ensure compliance, and ultimately support sustainable productivity growth. And so to audience, thank you very much for the time and sort of view today. And we hope today's session will spark fresh thinking and offer practical tools to help you navigate and shape, agile regulation that support, development and also innovation in your perspective country. So please stay tuned and keep up with us in the more coming P Talk in the future. Thank you very much, and stay agile, stay flexible, stay healthy, and thank you very much. And goodbye for now.